Have you ever wondered how you should trim the bottoms of your platters? Well, you're in luck. In this week's video, I'm going to show you two different ways. Number one and number two. And we're going to talk about it and see which one is better. And here's a little sneak peek of what they look like on the other side. Ooh! Let's get started. So in this week's video, I'm going to show you how to trim your platters. And this is the normal style that oftentimes is basically the same way you trim anything. Very wide foot and the normal foot ring. And a little different this week, I'm going to show you a new style which has support rings inside the piece so that the middle prevents it from slumping. And so to get you guys excited, I'm going to be doing a glazing video on how I glaze something like this next week, so stay tuned for that. But anyway, let's get this piece ready to trim. And before we start trimming this, I kind of want to go over a few tips and tricks on how to get this popped off without warping. So the first thing you guys always want to do is, after you wire it off, if it doesn't release right away, wire it a second time and then gently try to lift and see if it comes off. Once it pops off, like this one has already, you want to try your best not to flip it over, especially because odds are they're a little wet. You always want to get used to flipping them between boards, like this, where you put one board on top of another, get underneath them, and then when you want to flip it over, you flip like that. And this helps prevent you from picking up the piece and warping it, because oftentimes a very wide piece with a wide bottom, if it's on the wetter side, can toggle or bend. So that's the best way I recommend. And because this piece is really wide, I'm not going to trim directly on the wheel head because it's going to hit the pegs. So I'm going to trim directly onto that, and we're going to get this centered as always. So we're going to spin the wheel, put my thumb here at 6 o'clock. Whenever it touches my thumb, that is the point that is the most off center. I'm going to stop it when it reaches that point and push a little away and repeat until this piece looks centered, and I'm going to wad it down. So spin, right there, right there, right there. So, and then push away from me a little bit. Now you could tap center, but I find tap centering pieces this wide often just don't really move because they're so wide it's hard for them to shift. And what ends up happening is I hit it so hard that I end up denting the walls. So I much rather center the old school way. Okay, that looks good. Let's get some wads and get this secure. Another tip, make sure you get all the clay off of your pegs, because that may cause your board to stay at a different height on opposite sides. So all I'm doing is putting my sponge on the peg and I'm spinning it. Not with the pedal, but just with the rotation of the wheel. Okay, that should be much better. So I got the wads, I got my caddy for the trimming tools, and I'm not going to need very much clay to wad this down because it's so wide. Gravity doesn't really try to pull this off when I trim, so I just kind of need these long coils, about 1/2 inch thick, and they're just wrapping around the edge. And get them all placed first, and then the first thing I do, I put one hand on top and I gently start pushing down with my other hand. In this case, this is my left hand, and I rotate to the opposite side and I repeat. And when I do this, I'm not trying to push it into the piece for two reasons. One, if the piece is wet and you push in, you may dent the wall. And two is, if you push too aggressively in, it may shift off center and then you're gonna have to recenter it. So that's never a fun thing to do. So always push down, and then the natural expansion of the clay will push it gently into the clay wall. All right. And whenever I do it, I always work in opposites. So if I do this side, I do the next side, opposite side next. All right, and then we do the jiggle test. Looks good, and then we spin it to make sure it's still centered, and we are good to go. I have this little bit that was left over from when I threw it, so I'm gonna actually peel that off first, and then let's get our trimming tools and get started. All right, I shifted my body a little bit so you can see my trim hand a little more. And so whenever I trim these wide platters, or trimming anything in general, I always try to remove the overhang clay first. Now, sometimes the outermost edge is off center. So what you can do is try to remove that to get a true center, and that will help you moving forward. So to remove the excess clay, the easiest way to do it is get a needle or a knife or whatever tool that's pointy. And what you want to do is at 3 o'clock, you point this directly away from you. So this is my midnight right here. So I'm not putting it directly at midnight. I'm putting it directly, so if you math people know some math terms, tangent to the curve, so straight off the curve. And so I'm placing it tangent, and I'm just marking a line first so that I know this is my true circle. Everything is centered on the inside of this. Everything on the outside you can see is slightly off. And then from here I just push down until I cut all the way through. Now you want to do it slowly, because if you do it too fast, you may gouge into the clay. It may trace in or you may bump out, and then you just get this weird spiral. And for these lefties out here, you want to hold in your left hand, and then you're aiming this direction, so tangent towards your right. And you're just pushing straight down until you cut all the way through. And then you can just slice it and peel it away. So this is not really necessary, but it does help in terms of creating a true centered edge. So then you take your trimming tool and you just trim everything that's beyond that true center. And so it just helps you kind of get more grounded, and you already have a nice centered side to work with. Because sometimes if your bottom is really off-center, it tends to just get more and more off-centered as you trim inward. All right, anyway, let's say I like the centeredness here, but I feel like the foot's too wide and I want to gain more clay on the clay wall here. The easiest way to do it is you just look at the angle of your clay wall. That is right next to your foot, so right here. You match the angle with your tool with the angle of the clay wall right where it's meeting the foot. Then you take it off the clay wall, move it up so it's about 1/8 of an inch into the foot, and then you start trimming diagonally downwards until it matches the same height as the foot. Then you feather out that new edge, and what happened is you're extending that clay wall up into the foot, and then now you go back to where the vertical part of the foot is. You can start trimming that away, so starting at an angle and turning my hand like it's a doorknob, or turning my hand like I'm turning a doorknob. And then I can see the new foot, or the new clay wall that I established. So it elongates the clay wall and it makes the foot a little shorter. So that's a little tip. But this angle right here, it's a little too upward. So I want to get this a little more rounded and flat. So I'm going to hold it like a pencil, and I'm just going to bring this down just a tad bit. And so switching to my larger trimming tool will be a little better for this. And then just rounding the edge, because I want a nice round bottom. Okay, bring this down a little more. Turn my hand like I'm turning a doorknob, and then bringing it down to feather it off and make it match the clay wall. All right, so looking at this, I still feel like my foot's a little too tall. It's a little wide, so I want to bring it in a little more. So I'm going to do that same technique again to elongate the clay wall and shorten the foot without losing actual height of the clay here. So I bring it up, match the angle, trim into the foot until I hit the current clay wall. That creates this big undercut you see there. And so then I'm going to bevel this foot, turn my hand until it's nice and vertical, and then I'm going to trim everything else away to make it match. And so I want the height of the foot to be the height of this trimming tool, and I am pretty much there. So right there, I like that height. So I'm ready to start trimming the interior of the foot. So I'm just going to clean this up a little bit, get a sharper defined edge here. And then I'm ready to trim the inside. So I talked in other videos about checking for clay thickness. You just put your finger on top and you tap. The more vibration you feel, the thinner the clay is. So I feel a decent amount of vibration. I can't trim it too deep. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to have it slope a little bit, like always. So trim this down and then trim deeper as I get outer or closer to the clay wall here, because the clay often gets thicker the further out you get from the center. So start from the center. So for righties out here, start with the center, hold it like a pencil, trim in the center and start moving it outwards towards 3 o'clock, or 430. If you're a lefty, you're moving it out to diagonally this direction, so 430. And then slowing down as you get closer to the actual foot. And then what I'm doing here, I'm just bringing this even closer rather than keep going all the way across, because I was pretty close to the width I want. I just wanted to get it more defined. Okay, so there we go. That was the first pass. Let's do one more pass. So start in the center, work my way out. And so the only downside of trimming a really wide foot like this is if your clay is really thin. So this bottom section is really thin, it may slump where this kind of concaves, or the complete opposite, it actually lifts up if it's uneven drying. So you really have to make sure that if you are doing a very wide foot, that your clay is relatively thick, or you dry it nice and evenly. So you usually want to prop this up on like a rack or some wire shelving so that air can get underneath. Because if it's completely flat, sometimes it dries slower on the bottom, and that causes it to lift up or sink. It really depends. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and switch to this tool, clean everything up. Then I'm going to adjust the outer edge here. Because I threw the piece at around 1/2 inch thick, I don't have too much clay to trim away. I have about 1/8 of an inch I can play with. So that feels pretty good to me. And I can trim this bottom section, this outer section a little more. So I'm going to go a little more here. I'm floating the tool, establishing a new foot edge. I'm trimming that down until I reach the same height as the outside. So it looks like if I were to cut this foot off, it has a nice even dome from wall to wall. All right, looks pretty good. Okay, now let's just do some touch-ups and some final adjustments. Just getting this inside edge a little more vertical. So with my left hand, I'm trimming around 4:30 or 3 o'clock. Very natural for lefties. For righties, you probably would have to trim at midnight, like so. But either way, that's a good way to get that nice sharp angle on the inside of the foot. This looks like it's flaring out a little bit on me, so let's kind of straighten that out. Round that little lip there. This one too. And let's add the undercut. So I'm going to switch to the skinnier tool. And a little bit of an undercut. This will help me grip it later. If you can grip it, honestly I can't. But this gives a little flair. I'm going to round this a little bit here. Now to get rid of the trimmings, you can take your trimming tool and then put your finger behind it like a rake and let it collect. Or another tip that someone in the comments on another trimming video said, you dip it in water. I have water off camera here. Dip it in water and then let the piece collect all the trimmings because it gets stuck. And so that works pretty well. The only downside is your trimming tool is now wet and it can get kind of sticky with trimmings. But that's another cool little trick. All right, looks pretty good to me. And then another test that you can do is you get a ruler or some flat object, you lay it across, and you want to see that you have enough clearance, especially if you plan to glaze the bottom here. You want to make sure you have enough clearance, usually at least 1/8 of an inch. I recommend 1/4 inch for you so that this won't get stuck. Now this is pretty close in my opinion. It's about 1/8 of an inch. That means I wouldn't want to glaze the bottom of my piece. And I normally don't, so that's not really a big issue. All right, anyway, last steps. Let's go ahead and burnish. So smooth the surface with some water. And I'm gonna get a rib to burnish and smooth everything. At least the bottom section. This section I can use my fingers. So I'll be right back with another tool so I can finish burnishing everything else. Alright, so I got a rib, a mud tool rib, very flexible and soft, and a brush. So the brush is good to burnish on the inside. Clear these trimmings so it's not making noise. That's better. So brush where your finger can't reach. I like it a lot on the inside of the foot ring. Oftentimes my fingers just can't smooth that and it stays rough. And I notice the rougher the clay is, especially on the foot area, glaze tends to stick to it more, even if it's waxed. If it's not super smooth, glaze still loves to stick to any rough spots. So remove any rough bits, and on this bottom section, using the rib, let's get it wet one more time, and then gently compress and smooth. And this part's always so satisfying. Right. And lastly, the inside of the foot, or the rib where my finger couldn't reach. And fingers to then kind of blend those extra water lines. And lastly, the outside.
If you're enjoying these videos, please don't forget to like and subscribe. That way it helps to grow this little channel and you can see the videos being released every week.
And there we go. We have a nicely trimmed wide foot. I'm going to pop up the wads. I'm going to leave it on this board because I don't want to flip it over just yet because the clay is still pretty wet. I don't want it to damage the foot, but I can reuse these wads. So I'll just place these on the side and I'll get the next piece and we'll trim the different style of foot for these wider pieces. Here's the other piece. Let's go ahead and flip it onto the bottom so that we can trim it. Flip. Get it on top and center. And for some crazy way, this is actually centered already. So let's get this wadded down and talk about the benefits of having the extra foot rings. So I got it wadded down, and let's talk about the benefit of having these foot rings. So the benefit of having these multiple foot rings is to ensure that the middle section doesn't slump or fall down during the drying process. And this helps support it so that when we flip it upside down, this should dry more or less flat. And so all you're doing is trimming the gaps between these areas to ensure that you have this being the same height. And that can be the hardest if your base isn't completely flat. So one good thing to check first is you can take a flat object and lay it across, and you see how flat or not flat your piece is. You can see that my middle kind of bowls down a little bit. So if I wanted to, I could flip it right side up and then push it down. Or when I trim this, I'm still going to trim the middle, and when I flip it upside down, like for example, I'll trim this, and when I flip it upside down, I gently push down in the center just to make sure that's completely flat. But anyway, let's go ahead and get this ready to trim. And of course, all my tools have gone up and left where they should. But let's do this and get this nice and trimmed. So first things first, getting rid of that outer edge. So I have a nice true centered surface to begin with. And I'm starting with my bigger tool this time. Establishing the foot. And this one's a lot more curved than the last piece. This outer edge right here is a little lumpy, so let's try to level that. Okay, it actually drops a little bit. So if you take a look at the tool, you can see it drops a little bit on this outer edge. So I'm going to bring this in a little bit so it's not so much drop there. And most likely what happened is when this was drying on the board, it started lifting up on this part and shrinking and pulling away from the surface. So that was from it drying too fast, most likely. Anyway, let's go ahead and trim that away and establish a new vertical foot here. Okay, I'll do it one more time. This time I'm not going to make it as wide. I could if I wanted to, because I have more supports in the middle. But for how much curve I have on this piece, it's going to look a little weird. Okay, and now I have this trench here, so let's level that out. And then round out the whole surface. Okay, and then you can also tap to see the thickness. So, like I said, I'm lefty, I'm left-handed, I like trimming on this side. But I do switch back and forth. So if you can learn how to trim with both hands, it actually helps in my opinion. That looks good. Now let's establish the areas. So if you wanted to, for your first time, you could take a needle and you can draw in the areas that you want, where you want your feet to be. So that can more or less help you. And so usually, if this was my outermost foot, that's where this would fall. And spacing wise, you kind of want everything more or less centered from one another. So this I could probably move out a little bit. But let's focus on this section here. So instead of trimming right here, I'll trim off to the side. And then just like I normally would trim, I trim down, and I pull it out, and I stop as I reach the next area. But because I said I want it a little more centered, I'm actually going to go a little further out than that line. So like I said, that was just a reference. And I'm going to erase this line because I don't want that to throw me off. And I'm going to start my next one here. Trim that down a little bit, and then start moving that outwards. Alright, there you go. So you can kind of see it starting to develop. If you want to start defining the edges so you can see it a little easier, that could definitely help. Now I'm using the corner of the tool. And then you can also bring that out and level everything out now. Okay, that's pretty thin there. Don't want to go too much more. Now if I had a really thick bottom, I could definitely trim this a little more. But I threw them, like I said, pretty thin, so I don't want to make my bottom too weak. And so that's where the benefit of having these multiple feet come in. Because it's on the thinner side, more chances of it warping. So these hopefully will make it not warp as much. Okay, now let's just play with thicknesses. This is pretty deep, this is not as deep. Let's go a little deeper than that. And then this one, kind of like that width, so I'm going to leave it a little bulky. So I'm going to erase that line eventually. And yeah, there you go. That looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and collect all of the trimmings. And so that was really fast. You actually end up trimming a little less than you normally would, which is nice. And then before I actually finish everything, so I just want to level it out and just clean up any lines. Just want to make sure everything's more or less flat, so that you can see here right now the middle is actually quite a big difference, probably because as I was trimming it was pushing. So I can trim this edge down a little bit if I want, and then when I flip it over I'll kind of push that back down so that it was level, because it wasn't this off before. So like I said, it was pretty thin, so I gotta compensate and push it back. So I'm going to just take a little bit off of here. And then I'll create the undercut. And now that I'm looking at this piece, it's pretty bulky, so let's actually take a little more off from the outside. And then I'll create the undercut. Round that out. Let's establish a edge right here. Okay, and then let's do some last bits of burnishing. clean this up right here. So this one I can't push too hard, it's gonna concave even more, so I gotta be careful. So mostly just focusing the smoothing on the foot here. And then the outer section. More light pressure there. And let's clean up this inner part of the undercut of the foot. Alright, and then touch up last bits and spots with the brush. And then I'll let this dry a little bit before I flip it upside down and adjust the bottom so that it touches. Alright, let's pop off the wads. Get the board on to flip it to. And I can definitely tell it lifted up a little bit as I was trimming. So let's get this on top and gently push down. Alright, there we go. Now it's back down. It was a little on the wetter side when I trimmed it, and it was a little wet itself, so. But that feels a little better. And one last tip before we wrap up the video. Because it was thin, and it lifted up and I had to push it back down. When it dries, it might want to lift up again. And so to prevent that from happening, and I know that if I push down, it's not going to concave because of those extra supports I put. Get an object. You can use a bag of sand, a bag of rice. There's just a container of sand in it. And just leave that in the center as it dries so that it won't lift up in the middle, or it shouldn't, because the weight up here prevents it from happening. And now this is ready to put on the shelf. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video and you learned something new about trimming some additional supports for your guys' platters. And in next week's video, I'm going to show you how I glaze this awesome swirl wave motif on your piece. And because I like to do my pour inside, fill it to the brim, flip and dip, I can't use my hands to grip it. So in next week's video, I'm showing you another way on how to dip your pieces using some common household objects to help you. So if that's something that you want to see, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can see that video when it's released. And at this time, I want to say mahalo to all the Mud Club members and a big shout out to the Mud Club Plus members. We have Winona Bannon, Michelle Zhu, and James Oates. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you're excited for next week's video. And so until then, have a good one, and I'll see you in the next one.